First of all, I'd like to say happy belated Veterans Day. I should have said that yesterday, especially since my dad was a veteran in World War II. But basically what we're looking at in this tutorial or video is the CSS equivalent of what we looked at in the previous video, which is the margin, the padding, and the border. And I keep saying that these things have equivalents in XHTML and CSS, and I ought to make my case at this point. And probably the best way to do that is by looking at div, span, class, and ID. And div and span are basically aspects of XHTML. Div is used to define a block of multiple lines in a web page, like a big box of multiple different kinds of things in it. And span is usually defined as an inline section, especially of just part of one line, like a few words or one word. And a class is another way of defining styles in CSS. A class has a class name, which is a pseudo tag that starts with a dot or a period. And it's referenced in the XHTML via a class equals and then the class name, where the class name doesn't have the dot. And this allows you to put a style on basically anything. You just say class equals and you can apply that style to any tag you want. And more significantly, to any div or span you want. Because a div and a span are sort of the equivalent of a class and ID, and that they're totally free form. You could put a div around anything or a span around anything. So it's a way of defining a higher level of styling, you know, more independent from content. And an ID is pretty much like a class, except an ID starts with a £, and it's referenced in the code via, whoops, I have this wrong in here, via ID equals ID name, where the ID name doesn't have the £. So these two are pretty much exactly equivalent, except one has a £, and one has a dot. And I believe originally IDs were meant to cover large amounts of material, like a div. And classes were meant to cover smaller amounts of material, like a paragraph or a span. But in fact, they're used totally interchangeably. If you do a view source on about anyone's code, you'll find classes and IDs totally used interchangeably. So the original concept of one being for one thing and the other being for another thing has been totally lost. Well, to do the equivalent code of what we looked at on the Rene Descartes, I think, therefore I am. I have two classes, odd div and even div, which indicates that I'm going to apply the classes to a div. And I have two IDs, odd ID and even ID. And I'm basically going to apply these to a span. Maybe I should have used span instead of ID. But that's life. And if we look at the actual code, I just referenced a class by div class equals odd div for the odd numbered divs, and span ID equals odd ID for the Latin equivalent of the English statement, which in Descartes is often given in the Latin as cogito ergo sum. And then for the second div, which is an even div, I have class equals even div, and then the text between the opening and closing divs. And then I have a span with ID equals even ID. So I just repeat the first one and the third one since we have a second odd guy. So if we launch this in Chrome, you see we get a stretched out series of boxes just as we did in WPF and XAML, and these adjust with the size of the window just as they did in WPF and XAML. So they are indeed equivalent concepts. And one more thing I'd like to add is that everything's a box as far as XHTML, and as far as XAML is concerned. So if I uncomment out this code, we use the format of CSS I talked about in the previous CSS video, but we have multiple selectors separated by commas, which is a shorthand way. If you want the same style to apply to multiple tags, you can just have the tags in the selector separated by commas, and it'll apply the same style to all of those. And if we go down and uncomment out the related XHTML and then run this in Chrome, it's actually below. Oh, I forgot to save the code in Notepad++. Now if we run it, you see the two blocks appear. One's defined by a paragraph and one's defined by a H3 header, which were in the selectors separated by commas. So that's sort of an additional bit of information. There's actually a lot of different things you can do with selectors and styles, and I'll try and put them in as painlessly as possible, a bit at a time. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and learned a lot, and I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe.